A rusted van buried under pine roots should have stayed hidden forever. But nature has its own way of telling the truth. When the hurricane tore through southern Georgia, it didn't just snap trees and flood roads. It unearthed something the forest had been paid to forget. Deep inside a locked hunting tract, a massive pine toppled and exposed the roof of a vehicle sealed in red earth. No crash marks, no bodies, just silence and steel. The license plate caked in mud belonged to a family that vanished in July 2002 without a trace. The Harpers were gone before anyone realized they were missing. For 21 years, there were no sightings, no tips, no evidence. Now their van sat in a shallow grave right where someone had put it. Not an accident, not a detour, a burial. And it was just the beginning. The Harpers left Brunswick on a warm Friday afternoon. Eli, a history teacher, had canceled his last 2 classes to beat the weekend traffic. Monica, his wife, packed sandwiches and a thermos of iced tea. Lena, their 13-year-old daughter, carried her violin like luggage. Noah, their youngest, brought a book on Florida birds and binoculars he never used right. Their eldest son, Daniel, stayed behind with a fever and a bottle of orange Gatorade. He watched them drive away from the porch. He thought they'd be back Sunday night with stories about canoeing and bug bites. He didn't know that was the last time he'd ever see them. When they missed check-in at the lake lodge, no one panicked. When they didn't answer the phone Monday morning, Daniel told himself the signal must be bad. By Monday night, the Harper name joined the long list of missing families from the Southeast that never made the news beyond a small-town headline. Now Daniel was 37. He had built a small window repair business in Savannah and lived a quiet life in the house where he grew up. His parents' room stayed locked. Lena's blue backpack still hung by the back door. Noah's shoes were still by the garden hose, untouched since the day they left. Daniel never left the house for long. He kept a binder of newspaper clippings, maps, and timelines. He called it the folder. Most people stopped asking about it years ago. But Daniel never did. When the phone rang the morning after the storm, he knew before he answered. The voice on the other end belonged to Officer Jody Price of the Georgia State Patrol. He asked Daniel if the Harper family owned a green Dodge Caravan. Daniel said yes. The officer asked if he could meet at a site outside of town. Daniel said he would be there in 20 minutes. He didn't ask what they found. He didn't need to. The site was locked behind rusted chain-link gates and brush so thick it took 3 men to clear a path. The land had once belonged to a timber operation, but no one had worked it in nearly 2 decades. A handmade sign warned trespassers to keep out. The area hadn't been surveyed since the early 2000s. The hurricane had dropped trees in every direction, but one in particular revealed the edge of a metal roof. It wasn't visible until the wind peeled back layers of moss and clay. Officer Price met Daniel at the clearing. They walked in silence to the exposed vehicle. The sun caught the faded green paint. There were no signs of collision. The windshield was intact, no broken lights, no damage that would suggest impact. The van had been placed there, carefully lowered into a pit and buried like trash. When the forensic team pried open the door, the interior was hauntingly preserved. Monica's canvas tote bag still held a library book with a due date of August 2002. Lena's violin case was strapped to the 3rd-row seat, one string snapped. Noah's bird guide was warped but intact, a feather pressed between the pages. The back seat was clean, too clean. No blood, no struggle, no bones. There were no signs of decay. No clues that anyone had ever died there. It was a ghost of a family frozen in time. Daniel didn't speak. He crouched beside the open door and stared at the steering wheel. The keys were gone. So were the people. But their presence was everywhere. The crumbs in the cup holder, the hand-drawn bookmark with Lena's name, the faint smell of lemon cleaner. The van was not an answer. It was a question that had been hidden for too long. A forensic geologist named Carla DeWitt was brought in to study the soil. Within an hour, she determined that the ground had been manually altered. The pit was not natural. It had been dug by machinery, the van inserted, and then covered with packed soil. Pine saplings had been planted across the top, now fully grown. It was a methodical burial. Whoever did it wanted time to erase the trail. And for 21 years, time did exactly that. Until the storm, until the tree, until the earth gave them back. Daniel stayed behind after the officers left. He stood beside the crater and looked up at the swaying canopy. Something inside him shifted. The van proved what he had always believed. They did not run away. They did not disappear. They were taken. And now the ground was starting to speak. The road back to Brunswick felt both familiar and foreign to Daniel. The curves had not changed much over 2 decades, but the weight in his chest had. The closer he got to the place where his family disappeared, the more distant it felt from the boy he once was. Officer Jody Price met him at the forestry gate with a clipboard tucked beneath his arm and a tired look in his eyes. He walked Daniel through the site again, slower this time, careful not to step too hard in the soft ground around the excavation. The forensic team had been cautious. They removed the van with straps and a crane and placed it under a tent at a secure facility nearby. Daniel was asked to accompany Officer Price to review the items recovered from the vehicle. It was a quiet ride. The cruiser moved steadily past pine rows and open marshes, while Daniel kept one hand resting on his knee. He was not sure what scared him more, the possibility that more had been found, or the possibility that nothing else ever would be. The wind outside whispered through cracked windows, but inside the car no one spoke. The facility sat off an old service road outside of town. A long, rectangular building with metal siding and no sign out front, it resembled a storage warehouse rather than anything tied to law enforcement. Inside, a single desk lamp illuminated the items placed carefully on a folding table. A technician nodded to Daniel and stepped aside. Officer Price gave him space. One by one, Daniel moved toward each object. Monica's canvas tote was still zipped halfway the corner of a paperback peeking out. He recognized the title instantly. A romance novel she had read 3 times. The receipt inside confirmed the checkout date. It was due back the week after they disappeared. Next was the violin case. It had warped from moisture, but still held the shape of Lena's favorite instrument. The bow lay broken beneath the straps. The velvet lining smelled faintly of cedar and mildew. Last was Noah's bird guide. Daniel opened it gently. A bookmark shaped like a cardinal marked a page on red-tailed hawks. His name was written in pencil on the inside cover, neat and careful, like a school assignment. These were not just belongings. They were proof his family had been inside that van when it was buried. Officer Price pointed out that no human remains had been found in or near the vehicle. Forensics had combed the area surrounding the site, but so far there was no indication of where the Harpers had gone after the van was placed underground. That was the part no one could explain. If someone had gone to such lengths to hide the vehicle, why had they not ensured the same for the bodies? Or had they? Daniel asked whether dogs had been brought in. Price nodded. Search teams were scheduled to return the following day with cadaver dogs trained for deep soil and waterlogged remains. Until then, the van would be treated as a primary crime scene. Daniel understood. He had lived too long with questions to expect answers all at once, but he needed one more thing. He asked to sit inside the van. The request was unusual, but Price agreed. Daniel stepped carefully into the driver's side, sat down behind the wheel, and closed his eyes. He could still hear Lena's voice in the back seat, could still feel the rhythm of the road beneath them. In that moment, the silence felt heavier than grief. It felt like truth that had waited too long. The next morning, investigators returned to the site with scanning equipment and started expanding the perimeter search. The private land had been under lease since the early 90s by a shell corporation that no longer paid taxes. It was originally zoned for timber growth and private hunting access. The area had been off-limits to the public for over 20 years. Posted signs and fencing kept most hikers and hunters away. Daniel began to wonder if that isolation had been by design. He asked Officer Price whether this location had been searched during the original investigation in 2002. Price admitted he did not know. Most records from the early 2000s were handwritten and stored across several disconnected county offices. There had never been a centralized database for missing persons in Georgia at the time. This meant that the van may have been buried within weeks of their disappearance, and no one had ever come close enough to see it. It felt unreal. The idea that so many years had passed while his family's final location sat just 18 miles from their home made Daniel's hands shake with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. That evening, Daniel returned to the house he had kept all these years. He unlocked the front door and stepped inside without turning on the lights. He sat in the living room with the violin case beside him and the bird guide on his lap. He flipped through the pages, slowly tracing Noah's pencil marks beside each bird. The sound of cicadas drifted through the open window. Outside, the street was still and dark. For the first time in 2 decades, Daniel was not wondering if they were alive somewhere. He now knew they had made it to the edge of the state before someone or something stopped them. The van had not crashed. It had not broken down. It had been placed beneath the earth like a coffin, and yet there were no remains, no blood, no signs of death, only memory, only questions. The items in his hands were more than keepsakes. They were evidence. He promised himself he would not stop until he understood everything that happened in those final hours of July 2002. His family deserved that much. So did every other name still waiting in silence. The pine tract where the Harper van had been discovered stretched far beyond the original search grid. Early morning light filtered through thick trunks as surveyors from the county arrived with ground-penetrating radar. Deputy Alonzo Meeks oversaw the process, walking slowly between stakes planted by forensic teams the night before. The soil was still damp from the storm, and the air carried the sharp scent of disturbed earth. Next to him stood Carla DeWitt, the forensic geologist who had already concluded the van was not the result of an accident. She adjusted the scanner's settings and motioned for the first sweep. What they needed was not visible to the eye. Carla's equipment detected shifts in density underground patterns that would reveal whether the land had been shaped by nature or by something deliberate. After an hour of scanning, the machine gave its first reading. A large, irregular cavity beneath the surface was marked and measured. The team moved to confirm its shape. By noon, they had uncovered a second buried vehicle, half the length of the Harper van, covered in layers of compacted soil and shallow roots. It was a sedan. Its windows were shattered inward. The license plate was from South Carolina. Deputy Meeks called in the plate number. Records confirmed the vehicle had once belonged to a family reported missing in 2003. The name on the file was Whitaker. They had been driving from Charleston to Tampa for a summer vacation and disappeared somewhere in Georgia without a trace. For 20 years, no clue had surfaced. Their disappearance had faded from public memory, filed away like so many others. Now 2 families had been found buried within walking distance of each other, both hidden in the same stretch of forgotten land. Deputy Meeks made the call to escalate. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation would be brought in. Carla continued examining the pit that once held the Harper van. She noted the layers of soil on top had been added with machinery. The sediment did not match the surrounding forest floor. She found tire marks fossilized in clay just outside the filled pit marks, deep enough to belong to commercial equipment. Whoever had done this had access to tools far beyond a simple shovel. This was no amateur job. It had taken planning, coordination, and confidence that no one would ever come looking in this place. Meanwhile, Daniel sat in the back of Officer Price's cruiser, watching as workers flagged new areas of interest across the pine tract. He had asked to be present. Price had tried to talk him out of it, but Daniel insisted. He needed to see everything. The discovery of a second family was not just shocking. It confirmed a pattern Daniel had feared. He had long believed his family's case was not isolated. He had collected clippings over the years that hinted at other disappearances along the Route 17 corridor, all clustered between Savannah and Jacksonville, all families traveling south in early summer. The police had always dismissed his theory. Now, the proof was under their feet. He walked slowly toward the second dig site, where a portion of the sedan's rear bumper was now visible. He asked whether the car had been reported stolen. Officer Price shook his head. It had been reported missing with its passengers. Daniel wrote the name Whitaker in his notebook. Beneath it, he circled the year 2003. Then he underlined both. The van had not been alone. This was not random. The forest had been used more than once. That afternoon, Carla knelt beside a small pocket of disturbed soil near the second vehicle. The ground texture was different. She took a sample, noting the grain size and color. She quietly informed Deputy Meeks that she believed the vehicle had been placed in the same method as the van. Both pits were hand-dug and carefully filled. Both were topped with surface-level saplings likely planted to discourage exploration. It was a calculated act of concealment, not a crime of passion. The spacing between the burial sites suggested familiarity with the land. This was not opportunistic. This was orchestrated. She requested a drone team to capture aerial images of the area, hoping the pattern of soil disruption would suggest more possible sites. If 2 families had been hidden here, there might be more. As the sun lowered, casting long shadows through the pines, a grim feeling settled over the site. Investigators no longer wondered if this was an accident or a one-time act. They were now asking how many others might be out there just beneath the roots. The Brunswick Public Library had not changed much in 20 years. The brick exterior looked faded, and a vine now crept along one of the windows near the children's section. Inside, the carpet had worn thin in places, but the scent of paper and dust remained familiar. Daniel had not stepped inside since the summer his mother vanished. He walked slowly past the front desk and scanned the shelves until he spotted a face from the past. Marcia Bell stood near the fiction display, reshelving paperbacks. Her gray hair was pulled into a low bun, and she wore the same wire-rimmed glasses Daniel remembered from his childhood. She turned at the sound of his voice and froze, hand still gripping the spine of a book. Marcia blinked twice and called him by name, her voice full of quiet disbelief. Daniel explained why he had come. He told her the van had been found and that they believed his family never made it out of Georgia. Marcia lowered her voice and invited him to sit in the break room. She said there was something she had not told the police back then, something she had always regretted keeping to herself. Marcia remembered the final week before the Harpers left for their trip. Monica had seemed distracted, not her usual self. She forgot her keys twice and left a return cart out overnight. On Thursday afternoon, while shelving periodicals, Monica had pulled Marcia aside. She said Eli had noticed a white SUV parked on their street multiple times that week. He believed it was the same vehicle that followed them home from the school after one of his final classes. Monica had been nervous, but not panicked. She said they would still take the trip. They needed the break. Marcia asked if they had reported it, but Monica had shaken her head and said Eli thought it was nothing. A coincidence. Marcia had not mentioned it to anyone else. She assumed the family had simply vanished like others had in that strange summer. Now, hearing about the buried van and the second car, she felt a weight settle across her chest. She had kept something important buried, too. Daniel thanked her and made notes in his folder. The detail of the white SUV changed the timeline. It meant someone may have been watching them before they ever left Brunswick. Sheriff Emery Klein had retired from the county office 5 years earlier, but his name still appeared on case files from the early 2000s. Daniel requested an appointment through the sheriff's department and was granted a meeting the next afternoon. The retired sheriff lived in a modest ranch-style home on the edge of town. His front yard was filled with bird feeders and trimmed azaleas. He greeted Daniel at the door with a cane and a slow, cautious smile. Inside, framed photographs lined the hallway. Most were fishing trips or department gatherings. Daniel asked directly about the Harper and Whitaker cases. Sheriff Klein took a long pause before answering. He said both families had gone missing without any signs of struggle, and neither case had produced concrete leads. When asked about the investigation status, he admitted the cases were closed after 18 months due to lack of evidence. He stated that without a crime scene, there had been nothing to pursue. Daniel pointed out that the van had been buried just outside county lines and the other vehicle not far from it. Klein raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. He claimed he had no further knowledge of those discoveries. Later that evening, Daniel stopped by the courthouse. The public records room was mostly empty. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he dug through the shelves of cardboard storage boxes labeled with case numbers and year ranges. He located a file that mentioned the Harper disappearance and noted the closure date. Tucked inside was a short summary from the sheriff's office, signed by Emery Klein, stating the case lacked signs of foul play and would remain inactive unless new evidence surfaced. Daniel traced the signature with his finger. It felt too neat, too quick. He searched for any reports about a white SUV near the family home or the gas station where they had last been seen. Nothing appeared in the records, no mention of suspicious vehicles, no mention of follow-up. Daniel sat back in the stiff metal chair and stared at the file. He knew what had happened. The case had been quietly folded away. It had never been investigated with any depth, and now 2 families had been found buried within miles of each other. The questions that once seemed like dead ends now pointed in a single direction. The silence around the town had never been an accident. The basement of the Brunswick courthouse smelled like wet cardboard and forgotten history. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead as Daniel descended the narrow stairwell, escorted by Kevin Rouse, a retired courthouse clerk who now volunteered a few days a week to help reorganize old archives. Kevin had worked through 3 sheriff administrations and remembered when the Harper case first came through. He led Daniel to the far corner where dozens of document boxes sat untouched for years. Each was labeled with year ranges department tags or sometimes just handwritten notes in fading ink. Kevin stepped back and allowed Daniel to search on his own. For over an hour, Daniel sifted through files, lifting out folders and scanning for names or dates that matched his family's timeline. His fingers were numb from dust and paper edges when he came across a red-stamped file labeled Harper Case, reopened 2007. His heart pounded. The original file had been marked closed in 2004. Why had it been reopened? And why had no one told him? He opened it carefully, flipping past summary sheets until a black and white photo slipped out and landed on the floor. He picked it up and stared. The grainy surveillance still showed the rear view of a minivan at a gas station pump. A white SUV idled in the background, facing toward the highway exit. A timestamp in the corner confirmed the date as July 12, 2002. This was the last known day the Harpers were seen. Daniel scanned the rest of the folder. There were notes from a short-lived investigation attempt that seemed to go nowhere. A few underlined references pointed to the same gas station in Kingsland, Georgia, close to the Florida border. The file contained no witness interviews, no follow-up notes, and no formal report about the SUV. The last page showed a closure stamp with the words "insufficient lead material." The folder had been misfiled among minor civil disputes. It was never submitted to the central case archive. Kevin looked over Daniel's shoulder and shook his head slowly. He said he had never seen that folder before. Daniel knew what it meant. Someone had reopened the investigation, quietly found something they could not explain, and then buried the lead again. He folded the photo and placed it inside his notebook. If the SUV had followed them in Kingsland, it was more than coincidence. Claire Lantham was a freelance investigative journalist who had worked several cold case features for regional outlets. Daniel had read one of her articles years earlier about corruption in a missing persons unit in Alabama. He reached out with the information he had just found. Claire agreed to meet him in a diner outside Savannah. She arrived with a tape recorder, a legal pad, and a sharp sense of focus. Daniel laid out the items he had uncovered so far. The original van site, the second buried car, the misfiled case folder, and the grainy photo of the SUV. Claire took notes quickly and asked precise questions. She pointed out that Kingsland was a known pass-through for vehicles heading toward the Florida border. If both families were headed south, they would likely have stopped there. Daniel mentioned the Whitaker case and how their vehicle had also been found near the Pine Tract. Claire raised an eyebrow. She opened her laptop and pulled up a public archive image from a security camera dated October 2003. It showed the Whitaker family's blue sedan at the same Kingsland station. Behind it was the same model of white SUV. The timestamp placed it 3 months after the Harpers disappeared. Daniel leaned forward and stared at the screen. It was not just similar. It was the same vehicle. The bumper sticker, the rear license frame, the dent above the left brake light. Every detail matched. Claire saved the image and cross-referenced local vehicle registrations. The SUV had never been identified in either case. She believed it might belong to someone who operated under a fake identity or with access to multiple plates. They agreed that something had happened near that gas station. Both families were last seen there. Both vehicles had later been found buried in the same pine tract. Claire promised to follow up with contacts she had in law enforcement and regional press. She encouraged Daniel to keep pushing. He left the diner that evening with a copy of the second surveillance image and a feeling that things were starting to connect. For years, he had believed his family was part of a larger pattern. Now he had physical proof. The same vehicle had been present at the last known location of both missing families. That SUV was not a coincidence. It was a thread. And someone had been careful to keep it buried until now. The forest along the edge of Osceola National Forest held its secrets quietly. Old fire access roads curved through thick underbrush, many of them long abandoned. Daniel and Claire arrived early in the morning, following up on a name mentioned in a county employment record they had uncovered during Claire's last article search. Tom Duvall had worked as a park ranger during the summers of the early 2000s and had patrolled the region between the Georgia border and the outer limits of the national forest. He had never been interviewed during the original investigation. Claire found his name on a 2002 maintenance log that noted a fire watch alert was issued near the southern tip of the Tolly land lease. They found Duvall at his home near Lake City, sitting on his porch with a coffee mug in hand. He wore a flannel shirt and jeans, his white beard untrimmed but clean. When Daniel explained the reason for the visit, Duvall looked toward the trees beyond his backyard and sat quietly for a moment. Then he told them what he remembered. On the weekend of July 12, 2002, he had seen smoke rising above the pine canopy, but had been ordered not to respond. Duvall explained that when he radioed the fire alert, his supervisor told him the smoke was coming from a controlled burn on leased private land, and that no assistance was needed. He thought it was unusual. Controlled burns were usually scheduled with the Park Service, and he had not seen a permit for that area. He drove toward the smoke anyway, but was stopped at a gate marked with no trespassing signs. The padlock was new, and the dirt road beyond it showed recent tire tracks. He called the alert in a second time, but was told again to stand down. He left the area and made a note in his personal log. No one from the department ever followed up. When Daniel showed him the recent images of the buried van and sedan, Duvall leaned forward and whispered that he believed now the smoke might not have been a fire at all. It could have been something more permanent. He directed them to the exact location where he had seen the smoke. Claire marked it on her GPS, and they thanked him for his honesty. Duvall only asked that they not use his name in print. That same afternoon, forensic teams returned to the pine tract with cadaver dogs and heavy equipment. Guided by Duvall's coordinates, they began a careful dig near a hollow stretch between two small ridges. The soil had been disturbed, but not deeply. Forensic anthropologist Delia Oakes supervised the excavation, noting differences in soil layering and the presence of ash near the surface. Less than 2 feet down, a collection of burned bone fragments surfaced. The fragments were not fully cremated, but had been subjected to extreme heat. Delia cataloged them carefully. Preliminary analysis suggested 2 adults and 1 adolescent. The bones were brittle, some showing signs of blunt trauma before exposure to fire. Near the remains, fabric traces were recovered. One piece held an embroidered patch from Brunswick Middle School. Delia held it up in silence. It had survived barely through soil and fire and time. Daniel stood nearby, his hand clenched around the photograph of the SUV. He did not speak. The air was still. The sound of insects and the low hum of machinery filled the space where words could not reach. This was no longer just theory. It was evidence. It was loss confirmed by the earth itself. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation officially joined the case that evening. They cordoned off the site and began logging evidence under federal oversight. The remains were transported under secure conditions to a forensic lab in Atlanta. Daniel returned home with the patch in a sealed envelope. It was the first physical trace of Lena he had held in over 20 years. He placed it on the kitchen table beside Noah's bird guide and Monica's library tote. Together they formed a map of memory. He stared at the items and thought of his father. Nothing from Eli had surfaced yet. No badge, no wallet, no clothing. He still held hope that something more would be found. Claire continued pressing for documents tied to the land lease and any records about controlled burns in that region. She believed more sites existed along the access roads. That patch of forest had not been used just once, and someone with access and influence had kept it hidden. Daniel made calls to every missing persons unit in the region asking about other families who vanished without evidence between 2001 and 2005. The more he looked, the more gaps he found in the records. 2 days after the remains were recovered, Daniel met with Marvin Schultz, a retired insurance adjuster who had worked across Glynn County from the late 1990s until 2006. Marvin's name appeared in several archived files that Claire had flagged while researching unusual life insurance payouts. When they met at a quiet cafe off Highway 341, Marvin brought a worn leather briefcase and a nervous expression. He explained that over the course of his career he had handled multiple large claims involving missing persons. Most of them seemed straightforward at the time. The Harpers were one of those families. Their policy had been purchased 6 months before the disappearance, with Eli Harper listed as the primary insured and Monica as the beneficiary. The payout issued in mid-2004 had been collected by a woman who presented paperwork identifying her as Monica's sister. Marvin admitted he did not remember questioning it deeply. The documents seemed valid, and the claim was pushed through quickly by Coastal Auto Insure, a firm based out of Waycross. What Marvin found strange in hindsight was that the woman never appeared again in any other insurance dealings. She vanished just like the families had. No real name. No real trace. Claire cross-referenced the Coastal Auto Insure account and found that the firm had processed another life insurance payout in 2005 linked to the Whitaker family. That policy had also been taken out less than a year before their disappearance and had listed a cousin as the secondary beneficiary. The cousin collected nearly $400,000 in early 2005 and had used an address that did not match any existing property records. When Claire ran the ownership of Coastal Auto Insure, she discovered something more troubling. The firm was partially owned by a shell company registered under the name of Hugh Tolley, a former deputy and cousin of retired Sheriff Emery Klein. The shell company had been dissolved in 2006. Its tax filings showed inflows of over $3 million between 2002 and 2005, most of it untraceable. Claire printed the filings and stared at them with disbelief. Daniel looked at the names again and realized the same individuals who closed his family's investigation were connected to the company that handled the fake insurance payouts. The picture became sharper. These were not just random acts of disappearance. These were calculated crimes facilitated through legal loopholes and covered by false relationships. Jamie Rutledge, a detective with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, joined Daniel and Claire at the courthouse to review the financial trail. Jamie had worked cold cases for over a decade and had developed a quiet reputation for noticing patterns others missed. He sat with them in a small conference room and read through the insurance filings, land records, and shell company documents. He nodded slowly, recognizing the names of 2 other victims tied to earlier cases that had gone unsolved. Jamie made a call to the state's insurance fraud division. Within hours, an internal audit was triggered on every claim filed by Coastal Auto Insure between 2001 and 2006. Preliminary results indicated that at least 6 life insurance policies had been collected using forged identities. 2 of them were families Daniel had never heard of. The reach of the scheme widened. Jamie requested subpoenas for financial transfers connected to the shell company. A wire payment from the insurance firm to a private account in Alabama matched the signature of another former deputy who had since passed away. What they were looking at was more than fraud. It was a coordinated operation run by individuals with access power and a willingness to make families disappear. Back at the Tully Pine Farm property, ground crews continued mapping the area where the vehicles had been found. Satellite imaging revealed more irregular depressions in the soil near the southern quadrant of the property. Daniel watched from a distance as teams marked off new coordinates. He walked through the tall grass to a clearing near the original dig site and stared at the narrow stretch of forest that seemed untouched. It was quiet. Too quiet. Claire joined him and handed over a printout. It was a summary of the LLC that had held the land lease during the years both families vanished. Its list of owners included Tully and 2 other law enforcement officials who had signed off on missing persons reports during the same period. The company had been dissolved shortly after its last large deposit. The documents confirmed what Daniel had begun to accept. The land had been used not just for hunting or timber. It had been a place to bury problems, to cash in on lives that others thought would be forgotten. But now the silence had broken, and with it came the names of the men who had built their fortune beneath the pines. Claire stood outside the Glynn County Property Records Office with a folded map and a puzzled expression. The parcel containing the Tully Pine Farm showed a gap in the historical ownership chain. Records before 1998 listed the land under the name of a dissolved timber corporation, but from 1999 to 2005, there was no recorded owner. Yet insurance filings and county lease agreements still listed the address as valid. Claire filed a formal request to inspect the original deeds. In the dim archive room, the clerk handed her an old bound ledger with scrawled entries and faded ink. There, wedged between 2 dated contracts, sat a 1-page deed transferring the 3,000-acre tract to Pine Horizon, LLC in early 1999. The signature line had no notary stamp. The witness section was blank. Claire took a photo of the document and compared it with the Georgia Business Registry. Pine Horizon, LLC had no employees listed, no tax ID. The mailing address belonged to a law office that no longer existed. She called Jamie Rutledge immediately. The land where 2 families had been buried had legally vanished for 6 years. No oversight, no taxes, no trace of ownership during the critical timeline. Jamie followed the trail of the dissolved shell company to an address in Savannah. The building was now a pet grooming salon, but city records revealed that it once housed a private investigator's office linked to the original deed transfer. The PI had passed away in 2008. However, his former assistant, Anita Brewster, still worked in financial forensics and now served as a contract analyst for federal audits. Jamie arranged a meeting with her. Anita reviewed the shell company filings and confirmed that multiple insurance payouts had been funneled into Pine Horizon, LLC through a bank account opened under a false Social Security number. The account had been emptied in 2006 and closed without inquiry. Anita dug deeper into the transfers. She found one deposit dated the week after the Harper disappearance amounting to $225,000. Another transfer occurred 3 months later, matching the same amount but tied to a different policy under the Whitaker name. Anita began building a financial map that linked the payout flows, the LLC, and 5 specific individuals, all of whom had worked in county departments or insurance firms. The money had moved through carefully timed deposits and withdrawals designed to leave no signature. Daniel visited the land himself, escorted by a state agent and 2 forensic technicians. The pines stood tall, uniform, and eerie in their silence. The road in was rutted and overgrown. At the center of the property sat a weathered hunting lodge. The building looked abandoned. Inside, a cracked stove rested against the wall, and muddy footprints stained the floorboards. In the corner of a small back room, the remains of a safe had been pried open. What caught Daniel's eye was a family photo nailed to the wall. It was black and white, showing a father, mother, and 3 children posing beside a pickup truck with a Coastal Auto Insure sticker on the tailgate. The man in the picture looked like a younger version of one of the deputies whose signature had appeared on the forged insurance paperwork. Daniel removed the photo carefully and slid it into a plastic folder. One of the technicians returned from the lodge's crawl space, holding a decaying leather satchel. Inside were maps of the forest, with red X's marked across several ridges. The state agent confirmed that none of those locations had been surveyed. Daniel stared at the markings. He understood that the crimes extended further than they had guessed. Claire and Anita met again to finalize the financial report. The total amount laundered through the fraudulent insurance claims had exceeded $3 million. Most of the money had been withdrawn in cash or wired to offshore accounts. Anita identified 33 unique transfers tied to missing persons cases across 3 counties. Claire contacted federal prosecutors with the findings. Within a week, warrants were issued for former county employees, insurance brokers, and a retired deputy. Claire wrote a draft summary for publication, but Daniel asked her to wait. He believed there were still more names to uncover. The damage could not be undone, but the full truth deserved to be told completely. Daniel returned to the lodge once more, walking past the dig sites and standing at the base of a pine tree where Lena's journal had been found. He ran his hand along the bark and closed his eyes. The forest had become a place of memory, not erasure. The land that did not exist had finally been brought into light, and every tree that once stood silent now carried the weight of truth, pain, and justice. The pines no longer concealed the past. They stood witness to it. As dawn broke over the pine tract, the search teams returned with ground-penetrating radar and fresh coordinates based on the red X's marked on the recovered forest maps. Daniel stood beside Victor Dunn, an FBI field technician who had been assigned to oversee the newest scans. The air was thick with humidity, and the scent of pine bark clung to every breath. They moved to the area just beyond the second ridge, where the ground had dipped unnaturally. Victor's equipment pulsed steadily as the radar sent signals deep beneath the soil. After several slow passes, the team identified a distinct rectangular void 3 feet below the surface. Shovels replaced scanners, and the earth gave way in layers. Less than an hour later, someone unearthed a sealed plastic bag that had been flattened by decades of weight. Daniel stepped forward, gloved hands trembling as he peeled it open. Inside was a spiral-bound notebook. Its cover had faded, but on the inside page, in a young girl's handwriting, read the name Lena Harper. Daniel held it against his chest, his breath caught between a gasp and a sob. The forest fell silent as everyone around him stopped moving. Later that day, Daniel sat alone on the back of a transport vehicle, reading page after page of his sister's journal. The entries began normally, notes about their trip games they played and the van songs they sang as a family. But as the pages turned, the tone shifted. She described being stopped by men in uniform who ordered their father to drive off the main road. She wrote that Monica argued, but Eli complied. They drove for miles until the trees closed in and their cell phones lost signal. Lena described being kept inside the van for hours while voices argued outside. Then came the final entry. Her handwriting had become uneven, rushed. It said they made Dad turn. We did not want to, but they made him. Mom cried and said to hold my brother's hand. Daniel closed the notebook and pressed it to his forehead. This was not an accident. It had never been one. Lena's words had survived 21 years in silence. Now they screamed through the pages with a clarity no investigator could dispute. Her voice had not vanished. It had waited. It had endured. It had delivered them the truth. That evening, excavation resumed around the second anomaly found beside the Harper van. Investigators discovered another vehicle buried nose down beneath a mound of stones and fill dirt. Its rusted frame matched the make and model of the Whitaker family sedan. When the vehicle was opened, the smell of old decay escaped in waves. Inside were human remains tangled together in the back seat. Dental records and personal items confirmed their identities. Madeline Whitaker was notified, and arrangements were made for a formal identification. A pair of earrings, a silver cross necklace, and her father's monogrammed watch were recovered from the debris. As the remains were carefully removed, a technician paused and handed over a small box wedged under the driver's seat. Inside were family photos, one of which showed Madeline as a child between her parents at a state park. The edges were curled, but the image remained. When Madeline arrived on site the next morning, she stood over the open case, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. She reached out and held Daniel's hand. Nothing needed to be said. Grief had its own language, and both of them understood it fluently. The scale of the operation became undeniable. Claire and Anita continued compiling financial data as new evidence emerged from the property. The number of burial sites rose to 5. Each one contained remains artifacts or personal effects linked to separate families once listed as missing. Federal agents expanded the investigation, focusing on cross-referencing insurance payouts, land transactions, and personnel records from multiple counties. Jamie Rutledge confirmed that all victims had policies tied to Coastal Auto Insure or its affiliates. It had taken 21 years to connect the patterns, but now every thread pointed back to the same group of men who used law enforcement power to cover their tracks. The forest no longer protected them. Every pine tree that once stood as silent witness now formed a wall of testimony. Daniel visited the site again with Angela Finch, a trauma psychologist helping families process the new findings. Angela watched as Daniel placed a stone beneath the tree where Lena's journal was found. On it, he etched her initials and a date. He said he would return every year on that day to remember her not for how she was lost, but for how she was found. The wind moved gently through the pines on the morning they gathered, just as it had during the first days of the investigation. But now, instead of hiding secrets beneath layers of bark and soil, the trees stood quiet and reverent around rows of folding chairs, a wooden platform, and a plaque waiting to be unveiled. Daniel Harper adjusted his tie as he looked out over the growing crowd. Reporters, families, agents, former classmates, librarians, and strangers who had followed the case from their living rooms all stood side by side. Among them, Madeline Whitaker held a bouquet of white lilies, her fingers wrapped tightly around the stems. Claire Lantham stood beside a banner that read, Harper Whitaker Memorial Center. Just beyond the edge of the event, the forest had been trimmed back, exposing the clearing where the first vehicle had been found. The ground was seeded with grass, and the jagged wound of the dig site had been replaced with a quiet garden. It was not just a memorial. It was a space carved from truth, cleared by years of silence, finally broken. Daniel stepped to the podium. His voice did not tremble. He thanked the search teams, the forensic analysts, the journalists, the agents, and the quiet witnesses who had finally come forward. He did not mention names to protect those still grieving, but his words held weight. He said that for 21 years his sister's voice had been missing, tucked between trees and time. He said that silence was not just absence. Sometimes it was proof that someone had been denied a place in the world. Today, he said, they reclaimed that place. The garden behind him now held 2 stone benches, one for the Harpers and one for the Whitakers, engraved with names, ages, and the simple phrase, finally found. Angela Finch stood off to the side, her hands folded respectfully. She had spent the last few weeks helping families prepare for this day. She knew closure did not come all at once. It came in fragments, in conversations, in quiet spaces where pain and love could sit beside one another. After the ceremony, Madeline knelt beside the bench bearing her parents' names. She placed the lilies beneath the base and opened a small velvet pouch. From it, she removed her father's watch and her mother's wedding ring. They had been returned to her in a sealed envelope the week before. She pressed the items into the soil beneath a new pine sapling planted at the edge of the garden. She whispered something no one else could hear. When she stood, Daniel was waiting with a small journal in his hand. He handed it to her carefully. It was Lena's. Madeline placed her palm over the cover and nodded without words. She said she had dreamed for years about what had happened, about what her family had gone through. Now she would read the truth. Now she could stop guessing. They sat together on the bench, the sun casting dappled light through the branches above them. That evening, Claire and Anita submitted the final report to federal authorities. Their documentation outlined 6 families confirmed to have been buried in the same region. 4 others remained under investigation. The fraudulent insurance claims totaled over $3 million. Most of the money had disappeared into offshore accounts or been withdrawn in cash. At least 9 individuals had been arrested across 3 counties, including retired deputies, former insurance brokers, and 1 county clerk who had falsified ownership records for Pine Horizon LLC. Sheriff Emery Klein had passed away in 2011, but evidence linked him to multiple approvals and file closures. Hugh Tolley, now facing federal indictment, remained silent under questioning. No further bodies were expected to be found, though search teams would continue checking locations flagged by the forest maps. The operation, once hidden beneath the ordinary trees of a forgotten hunting lease, had unraveled into one of the largest rural fraud cases in state history. Daniel returned home to Savannah, where he resumed work at his small window repair business. On the wall above his desk, he framed the first page of Lena's journal. It sat beside a photo of his parents taken on their wedding day. Occasionally, he would glance at it during quiet afternoons, not with sorrow, but with something softer. He began to receive letters from other families of missing persons. Some wrote to say thank you. Others wrote with questions, fears, or stories of their own disappearances unresolved and buried by years of unanswered calls. Daniel did not reply to every message, but he read them all. He started attending meetings for advocates working on cold cases. Eventually, he partnered with Angela to launch a support line based out of the Memorial Center. It became a place not only of remembrance, but of connection. People came to walk the path, to sit beneath the pines, to remember what had been lost and what had been recovered. In the final days of October, just before the anniversary of his family's disappearance, Daniel visited the center alone. He brought with him a bundle of letters he had never mailed and a new journal. He walked the perimeter of the garden, stopping beneath the sapling Madeline had planted. He placed the letters into a tin box, and buried it gently beneath the tree. He then sat on the bench with the journal open in his lap. In the first line, he wrote, "Thank you for waiting." The land around him felt still, not because it was empty, but because it had been filled with truth. He believed there was more to find in this world, more voices to unbury. But for now, this piece of forest no longer belonged to the men who tried to profit from its shadows. It belonged to the ones who had waited to be remembered. It belonged to the ones who had held hands in the dark and whispered love to each other when no one else could hear. If this story moved, you take a moment to like and subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Share your thoughts about the plot in the comments and let us know where in the world you are watching from. Your voice matters here.